Well, welcome to our penultimate faculty seminar in the Rixery series, and I am really happy to see all of you here. So I'm looking forward to this talk. I've been looking forward to it for the whole year, actually. But I'm not going to introduce our speaker for the day. I'm going to leave that to our colleague Gary Segura. But I just wanted to welcome you all. It's nice to see you. Just to note that we have one last talk in the series that will happen next month, June 5th. Here in Margaret Jacks Hall. There's plenty of food. Let's be engaged with one another. I want to also announce that there's the Ernesto Galarza annual commemorative lecture, which will be held on Tuesday, May 21st. 20th, that's the 20th, yeah. And that's going to be held in Tresseter at 5 o'clock. Okay, you see the posters on your table. I didn't memorize it. My head is not quite here yet. But so please take a look at at all the great things, because there's a lot of stuff going on through CSRE. So I welcome you on behalf of our director, Jose David Saldivar, and myself, and I'm going to turn it over to Professor Segura right now. Thank you.
So it's my privilege to introduce our speaker today. My colleague and friend, Dara Strolovich, holds a PhD in political science from Yale University. And she just wrapped up the start of her career as an assistant and early associate professor at the University of Minnesota. And she visits us in transition to her new position as a professor of gender and sexuality studies at Princeton University. So she went from Minneapolis to Princeton by way of the Bay Area, which is unusual to say the least, but we've been happy to have her here. Dara works on questions of marginalization and inequality, and think of those terms in the broadest possible sense by examining in her work race, class, gender, and sexuality alone, in comparison, and in their intersections. And in my view, that's kind of the future of identity studies, is sort of thinking about that matrix of identities and what they mean, what social meanings are imbued, and what social disadvantages flow from that. Dara's first book, Affirmative Advocacy, Race, Class, and Gender in the Interest Group Politics, looked at how advocates for these identities, for women, for people of color, for low-income persons, represent intersectionality and illustrate how that concept works in national politics. That book is one of the most recognized in the discipline, having won the Gladys Kammermer Award for the best book on U.S. national policy from the American Political Science Association, the Leon Epstein Award for the best book on parties and organizations, and an award from the American Sociological Association, the Distinguished Contribution to Scholarship on Race, Class, and Gender. In some of her other work, Dara has done some work on the interest group environment and lobbying environment more broadly with an edited volume from Congressional Quarterly Press. And her works appeared in leading journals in two disciplines. So the Journal of Politics, Perspective on Politics, the American Journal of Sociology, Social Science Quarterly, American Behavioral Scientist, Politics and Gender, and the Du Bois Review. So she's got a foot firmly in both the political and sociological camps. Professor Strolovich is currently working on a book examining the political construction of national crises and their implication for marginalized groups. And we're going to hear from that project today. So her talk is entitled, When Bad Things Happen to Privileged People, Marginalization, Representation, and the Political Construction of Crisis. Please join me in welcoming Professor Dara Strolovich.
Thanks, Gary. That was the nicest introduction I think I've ever had. She's like a side job as my agent. And I wanted to thank you and Jose David and Mariam and Heidi and Prudence and Milton for a wonderful year. I know it's a busy time for everybody. I'm really glad everybody's here, but it's been really great to have this year, what I've been calling my gap year between job A and job B, and being able to do my work here has been wonderful, and it's really great to be able to talk to you a little bit about some of it today. Sorry, I want to start my timer. They told me I could talk for an hour, but I'm going to try not to. But I probably will. Anyway, just start signaling if it gets too much. So Gary mentioned that the talk is part of this broader and ongoing book project, and as the title suggests, it's trying to make sense of the political implications of the nexus of three things that might at first seem to be kind of at odds with one another, but that I argue together are among the defining problems, issues of the last decade and a half, at least. So on the one hand, that since 2001, the American political landscape has been shaped by, and many argue, increasingly defined by, the convergence and seeming ubiquity of what I'm going to refer to for now using the highly technical term bad things. So from 9/11 itself to disasters like Hurricane Katrina, the so-called Great Recession, the mortgage meltdown. But on the other hand, I also take as a starting point arguments made by scholars like Stuart Hall, Murray Edelman, Deborah Stone, who remind us that crisis is a construct. That is, while the post-9/11 narrative assumes in many ways that crisis is a material thing, the contours of which we can identify, measure, and most centrally for my purposes, distinguish from non-crisis, we know that many of the issues brought into relief by phenomena like the ones I just mentioned, depressions, wars, etc., are actually not new problems. They're not unanticipated upheavals. They're not discrete incidents coming out of nowhere. They're not isolated ruptures. And scholars in political science and agenda setting have shown they're often instead new or in some ways particular manifestations of long-standing conditions that come to be, and hence the definition, treated as crises by dominant political actors because they're newly salient to new, and as I'll argue, often relatively privileged populations. I also was making a joke to some people before the talk that I did not pay Tal Fortgang from Princeton University to put privilege back in the news this week. I won't really be talking about Princeton undergrads now, although I'm sure by the fall I'll have all kinds of opinions. Anyway. But some of you will recall, for example, Rahm Emanuel's now near mythic statement to a group of CEOs soon after President Obama was elected that you never want a serious crisis to go to waste. Things that we postponed for too long, that were long-term, are now immediate and must be dealt with. This crisis, and by this crisis he meant the financial crisis, provides the opportunity for us to do things that you could not do before. Now, as we know, he was referring to things like high rates of unemployment, high rates of home foreclosures, but as many of us also know, these conditions, what John Kingdon calls conditions, have long plagued low-income people, people of color, and single women of all races. So for example, and I'll just talk about this a little bit more later, foreclosure rates were actually higher among African Americans, Latinos, American Indians, and by some measures, although I don't have the data here, female-headed households in the booming 90s than they were among whites and male breadwinner-headed households during what came to be known as the foreclosure crisis of the early 2000s. So I've gone over one hand, two hand. On the third hand, as with other constructs, so crisis is a construct, sure, as with other constructs like race, like gender, whether or not a crisis is in fact hailed into being has real-world political and distributional effects, some of which are particularly pronounced for members of marginalized groups. So for example, because the disparately high foreclosure rates among single women and people of color that I show on the slide were not treated as crises by dominant political actors and institutions, they also weren't used to justify the mobilization of political attention, government action, state resources to alleviate or resolve the problem. And insofar as the term crisis has been or is often applied to these and other related manifestations of structural inequalities, it's typically on the part of members of affected marginalized communities themselves or on the part of dominant political actors as a way that allows them to blame members of these communities for their own and often even for broader social problems. So taking these assumptions as a sort of point of this nexus of departure, I argue that before we can understand the implications of crises for politics, we first need to take a step back and, to borrow some language from a French sociologist, Edgar Morin, from 1976, put the concept of crisis in crisis, basically denaturalizing the very idea of crisis so that we can consider the use of the term, you're going to hear the word crisis a lot, the use of the term crisis as a way to describe some bad things, to question its absence as a designator for other bad things, so to think about those crises that do go to waste, for example, to borrow Emmanuel again, and to assess the political and distributional implications of these variations, which I will argue are key to understanding the uneven trajectories of progress for marginalized groups. Now, as this cluttered, crowded, too small font slide suggests, in taking up these questions, I'm entering some pretty long-standing but recently rejuvenated conversations, both scholarly and popular. In political science, these have had most to do with whether and how crises structure political and policy development and change, but as you can see, the conversations are not simply in political science. And my approach is heavily indebted to all of these ideas, related ones about panics, disasters, catastrophes, as well, at the same time as I'm trying to shift the focus to a somewhat different set of questions about the ways in which crisis and ideas about crisis are implicated in American politics and public policy. And in particular, the book and my talk today are structured and animated by three central clusters of questions. So first, there's a pretty, in some ways, basic one, and in some ways, overdetermined one, but which bad things come to be constructed as crises and which don't? And the answer in some ways will be unsurprising, but in other ways I hope more surprising. Second, what are the political processes through which this construction happens, and how, why, and when did crisis come to so dominate contemporary politics? Finally, once a bad thing has been constructed as a crisis, what are its implications for marginalized groups, including women, low-income people, people of color, and LGBT people, especially for those whose marginality is constituted by what scholars have come to call intersectional marginalization. And together, I hope, answering these questions will address this more general and overarching one. So what are the implications of hard times for groups for whom times are always, to varying degrees, always hard? And scholars have presented conflicting accounts of these effects, with some finding that crises often make things worse, materially, especially for marginalized groups, but others are arguing that on the political side, they can actually present some unique opportunities to advance progressive agendas. And I try to argue, and I'll get to this later in the talk, that we can adjudicate this seeming tension, or what can seem like a tension, by thinking about crises, not surprisingly, intersectionally. And rather than focusing on a single chapter analysis in the time I have today, I think what I'd like to try to do is give you sort of an overview of the project and the arc of the project. So I'll start by describing how I've approached trying to trace the political construction of crisis, and then I'll talk a little bit about the recent mortgage meltdown and Great Recession to illustrate some of the ways in which crisis construction is implicated in the politics of intersectional marginalization. And then the final section of the talk addresses the third cluster of questions by using evidence from a survey of social and economic justice organizations, advocacy groups, that I used to explore the implications of 9/11 and Hurricane Katrina for policy advocacy for marginalized groups. So it's going to be kind of necessarily general and somewhat oversimplified versions of the argument and the evidence, but I'll happily go into more detail about any part of it for whatever's interesting. Since the project's very much in progress, I'm also in a perfect position to benefit from any and all questions and feedback, so I'll really welcome those at the end. So first, what do we talk about when we talk about crisis? Scholars from a range of disciplines have, as I've suggested, made arguments about the constructedness of crisis. And some have even really have explored this idea empirically, typically through case studies of particular events. So what have been the effects of Hurricane Katrina? What have been the effects of 9/11, et cetera. And social scientist that I am, one of the things I wanted to do when I started this project was to try to pull the lens back a little bit and to try to figure out how we might identify and understand more general patterns in these processes of construction, and again, their relationships to uneven trajectories of progress for marginalized groups. So rather than one single method or source of evidence or frameworks, what I've tried to do is try to triangulate approaches, and this first section brings together sort of big data. There's a big word around Stanford, big data. Been getting some help from Franny on that one. To bring constructivist theories about the constitutive role of political language into conversation with historical scholarship and with research about advocacy, social movements, and the politics of marginalized groups. And more specifically, I start tracing the origins and evolution of the meaning of the word crisis in American politics empirically by bringing what has come to be called a keyword approach to a relatively straightforward and in some ways kind of barefoot but I hope you'll agree, nonetheless, revealing inductive text as data analysis of political party platforms, congressional hearings, and movement-related publications, in which I begin by essentially tracking the frequency of, meaning of, and context in which the word crisis has been used, as this has varied over time and among differently located actors. And as many of you know, the term keyword comes most especially from British cultural theorist Raymond Williams, who used the word to capture a phenomenon that he encountered when he returned to England after World War II, and as he described it, found that certain meanings of certain words had shifted. So for him, the word culture had become multiple things that were sort of specific to different ideas. And that one of the things that characterized these keywords to him was that they forced themselves on his attention because the problems of their meaning were inextricably bound up with the problems they were being used to describe. And scholars across many disciplines have subsequently used these kinds of keyword approaches to explore the constitutive role of language in politics and to show how the terms that are used to describe social and political life are actually active forces in shaping it as well. Given the centrality of crisis in contemporary American politics, it's really, to my mind, hard to think of a term that's more ripe for this kind of keyword analysis than crisis. And I'll just say a few words about why. First, at the very most basic level, the word crisis actually conforms in several very basic ways to the criteria laid out by Williams, beginning with the fact that it matters in at least two areas often thought of as separate. So whereas it entered the English lexicon from Greek in the early 15th century as basically a medical term to describe the point of progress in a disease when an important change takes place, which is decisive in recovery or death, it then traveled to the realm of everyday social, economic, and political life. And by the early 17th century, it came to designate, according to the Bible, OED, a vitally important or decisive stage in the progress of anything. But also a state of affairs in which a decisive change, for better or worse, is imminent, particularly times of difficulty, insecurity, and suspense in politics or commerce. So that's sort of how we get that word. I'm in Silicon Valley, so I'm using Ngram now. Clearly not a perfect source of anything, but nonetheless, by comparing, a couple of different words, we can see that this kind of rise in the usage of the word crisis is distinct from, it's not just that every word kind of rises, that it sort of starts making its way in early. The Google books go back to 1800 and just after 2001. You can see a tiny little uptick after 2001, perhaps not surprisingly. And obviously this is a pretty rough and imperfect measure, but at least a kind of first cut at the sort of the cultural trajectory, right, of this word that has sort of infiltrated our vocabulary. That actually it's done so pretty recently. It wasn't always thus. And this is not a raw number. This is a percentage, just to make clear that there is a denominator there. But in spite of the fact that it is that all on the screen? Yeah, that it was extended to politics pretty early. This graph, which shows, you can't really see the years, crisis is a percentage of words in documents that I'm treating here as examples of the transcript of dominant politics, in this case, Democratic and Republican Party platforms that go back to 1840. You can see that with one exception in 1872, it's not really until the teens or the 20s that it starts to be used with any regularity. For a few years, the parties switch off, and then starting in the 1950s, 1960s, both parties use it every time. So every political party platform starts to talk about crisis in some way. And we can sort of see some similar, although not completely analogous, trends in the titles of House and Senate bills going back to 1947. Some of this is artificially constrained by when you can start doing when things become searchable, but nonetheless. So it's not just in the radical bluster of political party platforms, but actually in the stuff of politics, which haven't always been quite as blustery as they are now, but nonetheless are less blustery than political party platforms. So these data are not complete, but the central point for now is that based at least on the evidence under the lampposts under which I have looked thus far, and shine the light, from the early 19th century until the second half of the 20th one, crisis was used sparingly in this transcript of dominant politics. So for example, from I think this is this slide, yeah, from 1840 to 1956, so 116 years. Each party wrote 30 major platforms, but each one used the term only 5 times in only 4 of their platforms, for a total of 10 times in that 116-year period. And it's true, party platforms get longer over time, so there's more of a capacity, but as you saw in that last slide, it varies as a percentage, not just as an absolute number. As that list, and this is basically the range of topics that are called crises up to 1956. It was used and attached basically to wars, economic depressions, conflicts in other countries, and sometimes as a metaphor for general national malaise, this kind of bad feeling of we're in a crisis. And this is the first meaning of crisis as a political keyword that I've identified, and I've taken to calling it Justice Potter Stewart crises. Some of you will recognize Justice Potter Stewart remarked about attempts to define hardcore pornography that we allegedly know them when we see them. And these are the sort of crisis analogs. Everyone sort of knows that they're bad in some way. But when, as we saw in the 1960s, the word crisis increased markedly and became a common term within politics, a second set of meanings took hold. Yes, it's sort of amazing. And one that shifted crisis from a term applied almost exclusively to relatively episodic events as a way to recast a broad range of ongoing domestic issues and problems as urgent. So I've been calling them, for lack of a better term, lack of creativity probably, recast crises. If you have ideas, you can give me those. The trend actually began, I had wanted to map these on by year and by sort of by political actor, but I didn't have a chance to disaggregate them that way. But this begins quite starkly, at least at the party platforms, in the 1960 Democratic platform, where they talk about an education crisis for the first time, and that's the first time we see it in there. And then the uses increases, and the meanings proliferated after 9/11 again. Because it was war, we got sort of more Potter Stewart kinds of crises, so references to wars, etc., but also adding what I've been calling attached crisis, this kind of hybrid of the recast and the objective Potter Stewart crises, where people basically try to attach issues to the crisis of 9/11. Now, in some ways, this part isn't that surprising. What was sort of more interesting to me as I started thinking through this was that rather than a new set of meanings invented by these dominant political actors, the connotation of crisis to try to raise the urgency of ongoing and quotidian problems was already in common use among non-dominant political actors. And probably some of you are already thinking about the Crisis magazine, which was thusly named in 1910 after a line in an abolitionist poem. But looking more generally, so this graph tracks the use of the word crisis in the titles, and not in the Crisis magazine, so it's not picking up on that, in the titles of articles from a whole range of African American magazines and newspapers going back to 1899, I think. And as you can see, civil rights activists and people writing in these magazines were using this term regularly by the 1930s and especially the 1950s and 60s, as they argued that the ongoing quotidian and structural problems faced by African Americans should be recognized as emergencies in need of federal government attention, intervention, and resources. And then this terminological tactic was adopted by other movements, including in the 1970s by radical feminists who proliferated the term rape crisis center to try to shift the way we thought about sexual assault. We're seeing another everything old is new again. See that another upsurge in that now. And then again in the 1980s by AIDS activists, evidenced both in just the name of the organization, Gay Men's Health Crisis, but also again in looking at the use of the word crisis in the Advocate magazine over time. And here too I compare it to another word just to make sure that I'm not just finding that there are more words. Now, this part of the research, tracing the use of crisis language on the part of activists and advocates, in some ways is the most in progress, but I think the chronology and evidence that I have suggests pretty strongly that this is where the second meaning of crisis originated, that as advocates and activists tried to frame issues of structural marginalization as a crisis in their articles, congressional testimony, comments, legal briefs, etc., it was actually appropriated by dominant actors from across the ideological spectrum who began to use it to describe and to try to raise the urgency of an ever broader array of domestic issues that you saw in that cluttered slide. But even as these new uses were imported into the dominant political lexicon from the language of social movement struggles, dominant political actors almost never used the word crisis to discuss the ongoing issues of race, class, and gender inequality that advocates and activists had been trying to use it to describe. And then even from a very low baseline, and this graph is a little bit misleading and confusing, but even from a very low baseline of almost never using it to describe these issues, dominant political actors used crisis less and less to describe bad things that affected marginalized groups. So this chart, the reason I say it's misleading is it goes from 1970 to the data points are for 1970, 1980, 1990, 2000, and then 2001. So the last data point is 1 year after the second to last data point. But I wanted to kind of see if there was a shift. What it shows, though, regardless of how misleading the last one is that the proportion of this language associated with hearings on topics likely to have particular implications for marginalized groups, topics like civil rights and minority issues. And I should say I'm using the topics codes here that Frank Baumgartner and Brian Jones have used in the Agendas project. So I haven't made them up on my own, but they've coded them that way. Labor, employment, immigration, social welfare, et cetera, these decline over time and as the 21st century begins, but increase for defense and for the environment. And again, I'm still collecting these data. I can't say as much yet as I'd like to about the details, but what it suggests is that crisis is simultaneously increased as a way to define political and policy problems at the same time as it declined as a frame for structural marginalization, and that in doing so it reinforced the construction of some problems as urgent while normalizing others. And this last development is actually in some ways the most important way in which it's useful to think about crisis as a Williams-esque political keyword, because one way to understand this change, this trajectory, is that the problems of crisis's meaning became, in his words, inextricably bound up with the problems it was being used to discuss, in that it came to reflect and even perpetuate the very situation that advocates and activists for marginalized groups were attempting to use it to highlight, that the issues affecting them and their constituents were not regarded as politically urgent. So in other words, while it might not be sort of rocket science surprising that dominant actors use the term crisis mainly in reference to bad things that happen to privileged people, that this happened via the appropriation and in some ways reversal of the meaning of crisis activists were trying to use, made crisis both an indicator and a symptom of the very problems that its narrators had been trying to use it to signify. So far I've been tracking the presence and absence and prevalence and evolution of crisis as a word, and I think it gives us a sort of inductive way into thinking about these things, but it's a little bit mile wide, inch deep, and it tells us a pretty sort of surface level part of the story. For a bit more depth, I want to turn to an examination of the construction of two particular crises and non-crises, using, as I said I would at the outset, the Great Recession and the mortgage meltdown to illustrate the ways in which categories like crisis and recovery don't neutrally describe but in fact create social, political, and economic reality by reflecting and reinforcing ongoing racialized and gendered norms. So turning first to the mortgage meltdown, in the first quarter, and I started to talk a little bit about this earlier, in the first quarter of 2007, when the foreclosure crisis was widely recognized as being underway, the Mortgage Bankers Association estimated that about 3.6% of all loans were seriously delinquent or in foreclosure. But as I began to say earlier, longer-term data show that foreclosure rates among people of color, low-income people, female-headed households were at similar or higher rates well before the crisis was said to have begun. So you can see here, rates were about 4.8% for African Americans, 4.4% for American Indians, 5.4% for Latinos. And then, though the data are not on here, despite having higher credit scores, single female households were also vastly overrepresented among subprime mortgage holders by about 30% on average, but the rates were so exponentially worse for single women of color that a recent study found that black women were actually, this number is kind of mind-boggling, 256% more likely to have subprime mortgages than white men with identical geographic and financial profiles. So it's not that they're just more likely, that with the same credit history, with the same residential patterns, et cetera, 256 times more likely. As we might expect then, the sharp increase in foreclosures that began in 2006 took a disproportionate toll on African American and Latino homeowners, especially, particularly in majority minority neighborhoods, where foreclosure rates were higher and increased more steeply compared to other neighborhoods. And not only that, but controlling for average neighborhood income shows that rates in moderate income majority minority neighborhoods approach those in low income white neighborhoods, and foreclosure rates in high income minority neighborhoods exceeded rates in moderate income minority neighborhoods. So a real interactive effect there. And these disparities are, of course, troubling indicators of the ways in which hard times often disproportionately harm marginalized groups. But it's the indicators that were regarded as the harbingers of the crisis that most interest me here. And in particular, to go back to that slide again, the high foreclosure rates among some groups as early as 1996 did not suffice to constitute a crisis. Instead, these disparities were construed as the perhaps unfortunate, but nonetheless unremarkable and predictable, and it seems acceptable, results of patterns of racially segregated housing, discrimination on the part of lenders, lower average incomes among women and people of color, and, as it would turn out, federal legislation that allowed predatory lending to really wreak havoc in, as the name suggests, predatory ways. Rather than stimulating massive media attention and government intervention, these ongoing economic problems and disparities were normalized and were evoked as explanations and justifications for that predatory lending legislation. This is the only way they can get mortgages, which turned out not to be true, for higher interest rates, for higher non-conforming subprime loans, et cetera. And this just kind of tracks, it's almost comical. Again, sorry, you can't really see the years here, but this is New York Times data going back to 1980, and you can see that before 2007, the words mortgage crisis or foreclosure crisis are used 4 times in the New York Times. And then in 2007, you get 178, and then in 2008, you get 461. So obviously, there are other things people could have been using to signal that they were concerned in articles about these rates, but no one was calling it a crisis in this kind of way, and then it clearly became one, right? That was, there's the construction, it's right there. Sometimes it's right under your nose. Basically, when foreclosure rates among middle-class white male breadwinner households reached levels almost typical of, but still actually lower than those in minority communities and among female-headed households, that was when the foreclosure crisis was said to have begun. Now, if the example of the mortgage crisis illustrates the role of persistent racialized and gendered inequalities in determining when crises begin, I think the Great Recession illustrates that these inequalities also mark the criteria used to indicate that a crisis has ended and that we've returned to normal or even good times. So as many of you know, in December 2007, the American economy entered what came to be known as the Great Recession. And soon after it began, economists noted that unemployment among men was rising more quickly than unemployment among women. Male unemployment was reported to have increased from about 5% in 2007 to about 10.5% in 2009. Female unemployment was said to have increased from 4.8% to only 8%, they kept saying. And it didn't take long before political observers coined the term mancession to characterize this phenomenon, which gave rise to several years of debate and speculation and hand-wringing about the gap's origins, its effects, its meaning, et cetera. And certainly some analysts pushed back. They pointed out that the disparity was at least in part a function of declines in industries like construction, which remain dominated by men and which had been hard hit by the collapse in the housing market. However, once we're talking about naturalizing discourses that perpetuate inequalities, this male domination of construction and the fact that construction is far better paid than industries dominated by women were and continued to be in that debate taken for granted, sort of framed as natural, as inevitable. Of course, men dominate construction. Of course, construction that men dominate and for which they don't need college degrees is better paid than taking care of other people's children, a field for which you also don't need college degrees, but it is dominated by women, and especially women of color. So there was not much discussion about that naturalization. Others did note that women continued to endure the kinds of inequalities that had affected them long before the recession had begun. They remained concentrated in these low-income or these low-paying service industries. Average wages for men remained higher than those for women across all racial groups, which is in the figure on the left. White men with high school diplomas continued to earn about as much as white women with college degrees, etc. What there was almost no mention of, however, was the fact that women's lower rates of unemployment were actually, at least in part, an artifact of longstanding norms about women's paid labor, whereby the proportion of women in the labor force was and remains far lower than analogous proportions for men. So before the recession, as we see, about 91% of men between the ages of 25 and 54 were in the labor force, compared to about 75% of women in the same group. In other words, it matters a lot what our denominator is, and also what assumptions go into deciding what the correct denominator should be in determining what kind of problem we have. In this case, the denominator that made it possible to declare that we were in a man-cession took it as given that what was normal was for all men, or almost all men, 91%, to be employed, but that what was normal, and it seems perhaps preferable, was that 15% fewer women, at least less about 3/4 of them, would be employed. So it was true, I'm not saying it's not true, that a greater proportion of all men in the labor force were unemployed compared to the proportion of all women in the labor force. But even when that gap in female and male unemployment rates was at its peak, a greater proportion of American men than American women was employed. The absolute number of men working remained higher than the number of women. Those men continued to earn more than their female counterparts, and they also continued to hold better jobs than their more highly educated counterparts. And as in the case of the mortgage crisis, it wasn't these long-term structural inequalities that constituted the situation as a crisis, but rather the suggestion that gendered norms were being challenged, that gender disparities possibly narrowing or perhaps, oh my goodness, reversing, that was deemed the problem worthy of attention. In other words, the crisis was that white men were increasingly relegated to economic conditions previously and relatively unceremoniously reserved for women of all races and people of color of both sexes. So now we have to fast forward. I promised you we'd talk about the end of the crisis. We have to fast forward to September 19th, 2010, when the Business Cycle Dating Committee of the National Bureau of Economic Research determined that the Great Recession that had begun in 2007 had ended in June 2009. A few months later, in March 2011, the Bureau of Labor Statistics issued a report in which it showed that about 90% of the jobs that had been created in the preceding year during this NBER-declared recovery had gone to men, and that because cuts in public sector employment, which accounts for a disproportionate share of jobs held by both women and African Americans, and especially African American women, continued well after the recovery was said to have begun, by some indicators, actually both women and people of color, and especially African Americans, had lost jobs and were faring worse after the crisis of the Great Recession had officially ended. So if you kind of read these two reports in tandem, they demonstrate how gendered and racialized norms and the idea that it's natural for women to participate in the labor force at lower rates than men, and that it's natural that rates of black unemployment will be higher than those for whites, how both of these naturalizations mark ideas about both the gravity of the crisis of the Great Recession as well as the indicators that it was over. And it's only in such a context, I think, that an upturn in which 90% of the jobs created went mostly to white men, that we could call that a recovery. And while the NBER was careful to issue the caveat, that, and we know it's this kind of jobless recovery and it's a strange recovery and there's all kinds of strange things about the recovery, so they were careful to say that the economy was not operating at a normal capacity, even and perhaps especially because women and people of color fared worse. The notion that the economy had entered a recovery wasn't questioned. These racialized and gendered realities were at once subsumed, made invisible, and neutralized by this official end to crisis. and in fact that the disproportionate benefits of the recovery went to white men while conditions worsened for others has long been one of the conditions that make our sense of normalcy possible. It was true after the Great Depression, it was true after World War II, and here's that uneven trajectory of progress I keep talking about. In spite of the many social, economic, and political transformations since that time, it remains true more than half a century later. Now, constructed though they are, these examples make clear, of course, that once a bad thing, as I said earlier, is constructed as a crisis, it has real and far-reaching effects. Some of these are things like the disparities in the impact of the foreclosure crisis. But the next part of the book tries to examine some other portion of these effects by taking up most directly the last question that I asked at the outset of the talk. So what are the implications of hard times for groups for whom times are always hard? And at first blush, again, the example of the foreclosure crisis would suggest that the answer is painfully obvious. To paraphrase an oft-used expression about African Americans, when America catches a cold, we know that members of marginalized groups are likely to get pneumonia. So at the height of the Great Depression, when over a quarter of all Americans were unemployed, rates were closer to 50% for African Americans. And lest we think it's gotten super much better, you can see analogous patterns, albeit at much lower levels, in the most recent recession. So these are data about unemployment disparities in the largest 15 metro areas in the US collected by the Economic Policy Institute, where you can see that they're on average about double, 7% compared to 14%, 7% for whites and 14% for blacks in 2009. But as I suggested earlier, crises cut in multiple directions. And while it's difficult to disentangle the material and political effects, it's also true that, at least scholars have argued, their political effects don't always mirror the material ones. So scholars and political observers dating back at least, as I suggested in one of the earliest slides, Marx and Engels' claims about the transformative potential of economic crises, have argued that significant progressive changes often can take place during these states of exception associated with crises. And on this view, even if a marginalized group suffers disproportionately and materially from a recession or a natural disaster, these kinds of events can nonetheless serve as focusing events, what John King's called focusing events, that they open policy windows, improve the political opportunity structure, and that they can allow advocates for marginalized groups to advance long-standing policy goals that had seemed impossible in good times. So a range of political scientists and historians, including Chris Parker, Phil Klinkner, Roger Smith, Suzanne Mettler, show that even in the midst of what they acknowledge as the devastating death and destruction and contracting civil liberties of World War II, they attribute the war to expanding equal opportunity for African Americans, particularly during, and they argue because of wars. Oops, that was that last slide. But these kinds of silver linings, what philosopher Homer Dixon has called the upside of down, are anything but inevitable. And other work finds that because crises often produce calls for austerity and national unity, they can also limit rights and redirect resources in ways that make advocacy on behalf of marginalized groups more difficult, policy change more difficult, leading to political setbacks and even reinforcing inequalities. So in a somewhat oversimplified example, women's suffrage faced setbacks during the Civil and First World Wars. They were eventually rewarded for participating in the war effort, but during the wars they were attacked as unpatriotic for not focusing exclusively on the war. Legal scholars and historians have shown not only that civil liberties are often retrenched during times of war, but also that these contractions have particularly egregious implications for marginalized groups. The two most obvious examples of this are Japanese internment during World War II and more recent upsurges in profiling of Arabs and Muslims following 9/11. As I suggested at the outset, I argue that some of what seems like this kind of conflict or tension between these views of political consequences of crisis can be resolved if we focus on their implications for intersectionally marginalized groups. Very quickly, since I'm sure most people in the room are more familiar with the term than most other rooms, but just to make sure, it was a term coined by critical race legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw to capture an idea with a very long lineage in Black feminist theory and politics, the idea that forms of oppression, disadvantage, and privilege based on axes such as race, gender, and class and sexuality can't be understood in isolation because they're simultaneous and mutually constituted, and that they create structural, compounded, and cumulative inequalities that are different than and different from and greater than the sum of their parts. So bringing this kind of lens to bear on questions about the effects of crises for marginalized groups highlights, I think, that when we look that what look like gains from some angles might actually be more complicated when we contemplate their intersectional implications. So scholars have argued, for example, that the crisis of the Great Depression enabled the passage of redistributive and labor policies that advocates failed to secure in more prosperous times. So the crisis of the Great Depression allows for policy change, but other scholars have shown that about 2/3 of Black workers and female workers of all races, as we know, were initially excluded from a good portion of these allegedly universal programs like the New Deal, because many of its most major components, including Social Security, the National Labor Recovery Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act, all of those programs initially excluded occupations like agricultural and domestic workers, seasonal workers, and retail clerks that were dominated by people of color and by women, again, of all races. The National Economy Act went a sort of step further and stipulated that a husband and wife couldn't both work for the federal government or both be employed by the Works Project Administration. And since women then as now earn less than men, typically many women quit or simply didn't take federal jobs or participate in those kinds of programs, which basically had the effect of recodifying gender roles and women's economic dependence on men. And I want to stress here that the point is not just that some women or some people of color were left out by these policies, which of course they were. What's key here is that rather than challenging patterns of racialized and gendered poverty and labor, the very policies that helped to alleviate the crisis, this crisis of the Great Depression, and which are typically viewed as having been enabled by the crisis and as a consequence enabled the most emancipatory and redistributive programs of the 20th century, and that many argue would not have been possible without this crisis of the Great Depression, that these very policies in fact reflected, reinforced, and reconstituted intersecting patterns of inequality. So that was supposed to illustrate the New Deal programs. There are some good pictures. The jobs that women could take were also really pretty typically gendered. That's what that's supposed to show. Okay, so the last part of the book picks up on this general point, but shifts gears, kind of whiplashes a little bit, using evidence, not so much historical evidence anymore, but evidence, as I said at the outset, from interviews and especially data from a survey of officers at about 550 progressive advocacy groups that I conducted in 2007. And these data show that some analogous processes are evident in two of the most widely recognized crises of the 21st century, 9/11 and Hurricane Katrina. And just a couple of words, there are many ways we could sort of approach this question. I focus on 9/11 and Katrina because I think they offer a way. First of all, it was 2007, and we hadn't had the economic meltdowns in the same way. But they offer a way, comparing them, to sort of parse the potential implications of crises for marginalized groups. So on the one hand, many hoped that, or at least said they hoped, that Hurricane Katrina's devastating destruction might at least open some opportunities for civil rights and anti-poverty organizations to draw attention to endemic racialized and gendered poverty. 9/11 was expected to have the opposite effect. It spurred very quickly anti-Muslim and xenophobic sentiment, anxieties about immigration, new constraints on civil liberties, et cetera. But the idea that 9/11 would just constrain advocacy for marginalized groups is not a foregone conclusion, because it also led to two wars which, as I said earlier, in spite of their devastating effects, scholars have argued can actually open political opportunities. I'm happy to say more later about the survey, the interviews, my thinking behind them. For now, I want to cut to a few key points about what they suggest about political opportunity and intersectional marginalization in hard times. So first, to examine whether and to what extent 9/11 and Hurricane Katrina opened or closed policy windows and altered political opportunities for marginalized groups, I asked advocacy group officers a series of questions about the effects of each one on a range of factors. And the one that are most important here are whether they led to increases or decreases in public attention to their issues, public support for their issues, government attention to their issues, and the one that I'm going to focus on most, whether each had made it easier or harder for them to achieve their federal policy goals. As this slide suggests, the data provides some evidence that the crisis of Hurricane Katrina did maybe open opportunities for organizations that represent marginalized groups, but it's far from overwhelming. There's more sort of opening when it comes to public attention and opinion than government attention and opinion. It also seems pretty clear, especially if you compare the two highlighted numbers at the bottom, that any opportunities that might have been opened also seem to have been pretty vastly outmatched by the negative effects of 9/11, since, as you can see, almost 60% of the groups reported that 9/11 made it harder for them to pursue their goals, while only about half that many, about a third, claimed that Katrina had made it easier. And this changes a little bit, or at least gets more sort of subtle and complicated if we disaggregate by organization type, but very few of the positive effects are as large as the negative ones, particularly among the organizations most concerned with advocacy for marginalized groups. To try to get more specifically at what this means for advocacy on particular issues and for particular constituencies and populations, I also asked respondents to list up to 5 issues that had been important to their organization in 2000, so pre-9/11, followed by questions about whether they'd found that their goals on each issue had become harder, easier, or had they found there'd been no change. And this slide kind of summarizes what they did. So I aggregated their answers to these policies by organization in this slide, and they could name up to 5. To try, right, so the bars in this figure disaggregate the answers by organization type, and they show that while there's a lot of variation in the answers, respondents typically reported that it had become harder over this period to pursue their policy goals. So overall, 55% of the issues they listed had become harder, about 22% had gotten easier, and for about 22% there'd been no change. And you can see that LGBT groups are a big outlier, and I'm going to say more about that in a couple of minutes. To measure, so I promised that this would have something to do with intersectionality, to measure whether and how intersectional marginalization might be at work in these assessments, I adapted a four-part typology that I used in my 2007 book and coded the answers that respondents gave according to what kind of issue each one is for that kind of organization. So just to go through to make sure we sort of all are on the same page, I'll use this example of an African American women's organization listed racial profiling, which you can see I coded as a majority issue, as any African American woman is theoretically at least equally likely to be subject to racial profiling. Importantly, even if not everyone is in fact a victim in their lifetime. The same respondent listed anti-poverty policy, which I coded as a disadvantaged subgroup issue, which is really the sort of intersectional category which intersects race, gender, and class, affects low-income Black women, an intersectionally disadvantaged subgroup of all Black women. And I coded affirmative action in higher education as an advantaged subgroup issue. It affects primarily college-educated people, a relatively privileged subgroup of the constituency, though it's important to note that when I say advantaged or privileged subgroup of any of these organizations' constituents, they're nonetheless disadvantaged compared to the general population. And then healthcare reform is a sort of classic universal issue. So using these and a few other questions as controls, I ran a statistical model with which I will not bore you, but about which I'm happy to say as much or as little as anyone is interested later, predicting basically whether respondents reported that the issues they'd listed had become easier or harder to pursue over this period. And again, I'll say as much or as little as anybody wants, but some of the main punchlines are here. The significant effects are bolded, and the big yellow line is the most significant effect, which is essentially that disadvantaged subgroup issues had the biggest slope, as we say, got the most harder. That was the biggest effect. Since in those earlier bar bivariate data, it looked like maybe anti-poverty and anti-poverty and African American organizations might have seen some advantage based on Hurricane Katrina. I included interactions for their coefficients to test whether there might be positive effects, at least among those organizations, but they come out not significant at all. So what does that mean? Although the effect of 9/11, as you can see, remains strongly significant in spite of everything else that the model tries to take into account, once we control for these other factors, advocates from these organizations didn't experience any policy window that so many hoped that Hurricane Katrina would open to address issues of racialized poverty. Some of them said in interviews that they'd seen a little bit of fleeting window, but that it had closed quickly. This one respondent from an anti-poverty organization said that it disappeared, basically. But even after controlling for all of those effects, as that yellow bar suggested, it looks like the crisis-laden landscape after 2000 was particularly bad for the issues affecting intersectionally marginalized groups that, as I showed in my previous work, and that I'm happy also to say more about later, also don't fare so well in so-called good times. So as we can see, even after taking all factors into account, one of the best predictors, that was the highlighted yellow, of whether an issue got easier or harder was whether it affects an advantaged or disadvantaged subgroup. And these bars represent predicted probabilities of how likely it was the respondent said an issue got easier or harder, there'd been no change. The one at this point to pay probably most attention to is the big one that represents a 78% chance that a respondent said that an issue labeled that an intersectionally disadvantaged subgroup issue had gotten harder during that period. To think through some of the implications of these probabilities, I want to return briefly to this earlier slide that I promised I would say more about. So remember that LGBT organizations were more likely than any other type of organization in the survey to report that the issues they'd named had gotten easier. And when you look at the issues that they named, perhaps not surprisingly, a lot of this has to do with the increased ease they experienced with attempts to lift Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the prohibition against gays and lesbians serving openly in the military. As we know, repeal efforts gained traction after 9/11. This was particularly true after 2006 from the General Accounting Office found that it had led to the discharge of over 300 language experts, including 50 who spoke Arabic. And as we also know, President Obama signed the Don't Ask, Don't Tell Repeal Act in 2010. So the LGBT bar sticks out way onto the right into the easier thing. It's interesting to contrast it with the HIV/AIDS bar, which sticks out pretty far to the hard. And if you kind of pull out those issues, they look like mirror images of each other. So as much easier as LGBT organizations found it to pursue Don't Ask, Don't Tell, HIV/AIDS organizations found it harder to pursue their policy goals. Immigration organizations also are the stick out pretty far on the left into the harder to pursue goals. And when I looked across issues rather than organizations, I found that it wasn't just immigrant rights related organizations. Any kind of organization taking up immigration issues found a net that it was getting much harder after 2000 to pursue issues, especially issues related to undocumented immigration. And here too we see kind of a mirror image where immigration-related issues get hugely harder, military-related issues, not just Don't Ask, Don't Tell, but also things like women in combat, issues having to do with benefits for disabled soldiers, et cetera, got easier. The main exception to this, as some of you probably know, has to do with immigrants who serve in the military who under President Bush became eligible for expedited citizenship in 2002. It was rolled back for a little while, but was revived last year. And of course that all of this happened in the midst of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan exemplifies the kinds of opportunities that advocates for marginalized groups try to harness by attaching their long-term goals to these kinds of objective crises. And it may not be terribly surprising that, as has been the case before, the need for bodies to fight wars can present political opportunities to groups framed as worthy patriots. But while policy gains like the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell or the conferral of citizenship to immigrants who serve in the military might be things, as Gayatri Spivak has put it, we cannot not want, Such rights also rely on normative constructions of groups, and therefore also replicate and reinforce narrow and normative racial, gender, class, nationalist claims to citizenship. You can see this, that was the sort of cynical version, you can see this in an ad that was run by the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees in 2009, and I'm not sure if you can read the text. But the image, this very striking image of a white, prototypically handsome and masculine patriot, and its articulation of rights through explicit references to constructions of a good gay citizen, what Jasper Puar has called homonationalism, is emblematic of the kinds of policy windows that can be opened for marginalized groups in times of crisis, if they can make claims to citizenship based on their ability to serve the national interest in these kinds of ways. And as we know, policy changes are often tied to these kinds of constructions, but links among worthiness and citizenship and the national interest are often tightened during and by the bad things, to go back to that terminology, the bad things that come to be constructed as crises. This means that when wars, depressions, etc., open policy windows for marginalized groups, they often do so in ways that actually exacerbate biases against intersectionally marginalized groups, and thereby constituting racial, gender, and economic identities, orders, and inequalities along other lines. And as I argued in my brief discussion of the New Deal, it's important that it's not just that groups are sort of left out, again, by these policy changes that are made possible during these bad things that get treated as crises, but that inequalities and normative standards are rearticulated by precisely the changes that some group members welcome as emancipatory. And to the extent that these changes alleviate some of the bad things that are the bad things for more normative or more privileged subgroups of marginalized groups, it becomes ever less likely that dominant actors will perceive the ongoing bad things affecting less privileged subgroups as crises. So returning very briefly to where I began, in a context in which crisis rhetoric is so common, sort of the water in which we swim, we might be forgiven for thinking that it's just noise, that it has always been thus, etc. But the evidence that I started with shows that the story of crisis is not simply one of ever-intensifying political rhetoric. Instead, crisis is a keyword that has a genesis and a history in which its escalated use as a way to describe domestic problems was accompanied by a simultaneous decline as a frame for structural marginalization, and was dissociated more and more from the actual badness of the problems to which it was increasingly attached. So crises began basically as bad things that happened rarely, suddenly, often elsewhere, and usually to others. Advocates for marginalized groups tried to convince dominant political actors that their ongoing struggles were crises, only to see crises redefined as bad things that happened to a relatively privileged and narrowly conceived us, thereby serving to reconstruct some problems as urgent and to normalize others. And although my survey of social and economic justice advocacy groups shows that crises can present advocates for groups like women, people of color, low-income people, LGBT people with some opportunities to achieve long-standing goals, the data also show that such opportunities are tenuous, they're contingent, and they often come with significant costs for intersectionally marginalized groups. So while it may, to borrow Hillary Clinton, borrowing others, take a crisis to expand rights and resources for marginalized groups, and although it's natural, I mean, again, we cannot not want it to some degree, that advocates will try to push their solutions through policy windows that are opened by bad things that become constructed as crises. Attaching liberatory agendas to these kinds of crises can frustrate longer-term efforts to address injustice, constraining which issues are addressed, delimiting who gets helped and harmed by the resulting policy changes, and complicating, again, this uneven trajectory for progress for marginalized groups, as I just said, reconstituting racial, gender, and economic orders along new lines. So I said I wouldn't take an hour, and I didn't. It's 57 minutes. But I still sort of only scratched the surface, so I'm happy to talk to you about any piece of the study or the broader project, and so I'm really looking forward to whatever we can talk about in the remaining time. Thank you.